Hello everyone, and welcome to the Western Governors Association webinar, Rangeland Management Strategies and Tools Promoting Resiliency and Addressing Invasive Species. This is the third webinar in a series for Montana Governor Steve Bullock's National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative, and the aims of this webinar are to examine new development for increased resiliency to threats posed to Western rangelands by invasive species, drought and wildfire, and other stressors. And for the next 90 minutes, panelists will discuss techniques that maintain high-quality rangeland plant communities in areas where they persist and restore them in areas where they have declined. So we are going to start out with a quick introduction to the initiative by Troy Timmons with WGA staff, and then we're going to move through a series of opening remarks from our panelists and moderators. That will last for approximately 45 minutes, at which point we'll move on to the moderated discussion section where the panel moderator asks the panelists questions about rangeland management, and then we move on to the question and answer session for the remaining 30 minutes at the end, and that is where you as attendees get to answer, or where the panelists answer questions that you ask as attendees. And so to do that, I would like you to note on the upper right-hand side of your screen, there is a Q&A box. If you can type something into the Q&A box, a question for the panelist or the moderator, you can send it to us, and we will refer it on to them. Thank you for attending, and with that, I will hand this off to Troy Timmons, WGA's lead on the National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative.
Thank you, Bill. I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about the initiative and how what we're talking about today fits into that. The Chair Initiative on National Forest and Rangeland Management was instituted by our chair, Governor Steve Bullock of Montana, and what he wanted to do throughout the course of this was try to tackle four different areas, four primary objectives through this initiative. The first was just to give states a mechanism to share best practices, talk about what's going on the ground in different states, what's been working, what hasn't been working, so that we get a better picture on a region-wide basis of what is working and what's not with forest and rangeland management. The second is to look at the state of collaboration in forest and range management. Collaboration and collaborative processes can allow land managers and citizens, states, and local communities to work cooperatively to achieve management goals. And in some places, those collaborative processes work really well. In other places, they don't. And so one of the things we want to do is look at what works and what doesn't work in terms of how different groups work together to accomplish goals. The third thing is to take a look at the current statutory authorities that we use to leverage state and local influence in land management decisions. And those include things like Good Neighbor Authority, Stewardship Contracting Authority, just to evaluate how those tools are working, what are the shortcomings that we see in how those are implemented, and what steps could you take to improve how those management tools operate. And then the fourth element would be what can we look at in terms of recommendations for how states, how agencies, and how the federal government manage forest and rangelands, and what kind of changes can you make, whether that's internally or through regulation or if needed through statute, to improve how we manage forests and rangelands. What we're about to do today, it takes a deeper dive look into what we're doing with rangeland management. And part of this was stimulated by discussions that we've had in Montana, in Idaho, and in South Dakota at our workshops on this really critical issue. Jeremy Maestas, who is our moderator today, is the Sagebrush Ecosystem Specialist for the Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, and he was a panelist at our Idaho workshop. Had some really excellent suggestions on what to do with rangeland management, and so today Jeremy is going to moderate this discussion. We've got a great panel of folks that Jeremy will introduce to take a deeper look at some of the rangeland management challenges that are out there and some of the strategies to improve resilience and improve habitat on our nation's rangelands. With that, I think I'll, Bill, turn it over to Jeremy. Jeremy, all yours.
All right, thanks, Bill and Troy, and on behalf of myself and the panelists, I want to thank WGA for having us here today. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. Let's go to the next slide. There you go. So our western rangelands have always undergone changes, but the pace and scale of that change today, due to things like altered wildfire regimes, invasive species like cheatgrass, and longer and seemingly more frequent drought, is challenging our ability to sustain both people and wildlife on these landscapes. Next slide. Particularly west of the Continental Divide, places like the Great Basin, we've seen fire size and frequency both increase in recent decades. As you can see here in this figure, this shows fires since 1984 on top of western states and sage-grouse habitats. We're seeing megafires engulfing hundreds of thousands of acres in just a few days that were once pretty rare, but now occur almost annually. Next slide. The introduction of cheatgrass and other invasive annual grasses in particular has been a game changer. In the 1800s, rangelands could more predictably bounce back from fire and even drought over time. But with cheatgrass and other invasives now waiting in the wings to take over in the absence of our native rangeland plants, a favorable recovery can no longer be taken for granted. Next slide. Healthy, resilient rangelands have the capacity to withstand disturbances and largely come back with the same structure and function that we expect, as is illustrated here in this green box. However, rangeland degradation can result in this undesired state shift, a transition away from what we want into a less desired state, such as the red box here, where we have a system dominated by more fire and more invasive species. And once we break Humpty Dumpty, we may not be able to come back to the green box. And so we need to learn how to manage in a way that keeps us or pushes us towards that desired ecosystem state. Next slide. Fundamentally, managing for resilient native rangelands is a unifying goal upon which all of our desired ecosystem services depend. Whether your objective is livestock production, wildlife habitat, or watershed function, job number one should be to ensure our management decisions are promoting ecosystem resilience. Next slide. Managing for resilience involves using what we know about rangeland systems to better predict vegetation responses to disturbance and management and reduce risks of these undesired state changes. For example, we now know that soil temperature and moisture are key factors associated with ecosystem resilience to disturbance and resistance to cheatgrass, particularly in the sagebrush rangelands. Warmer, drier ecosystems are more susceptible to conversion to cheatgrass dominance than cooler and moister sites where growing seasons are shorter, productivity is higher, and the conditions are just less favorable for these invasives to truly dominate. We can use this information to implement the right practices in the right places to more effectively mitigate our risks. Next slide. Managing for resilience also involves conserving our western roots. Healthy rangelands support a diverse array of native plants that each play an integral role in rangeland resiliency. In a sense, we need to get back to the basics of range ecology to get people thinking again about what's going on under their boots and really discuss how management decisions are affecting plant composition and abundance, not only above ground, but also below ground. Next slide. Science has revealed that perennial grasses in particular are important to resilience and resistance to invasives. Once established, well-managed perennial grasses, like shown here on the left, this blue bunch wheatgrass, put down more roots than invasive annual grasses, which allows them to better hold their ground through drought and deluge. Think of them as kind of the icebergs of our rangelands. In fact, as perennial grass density goes up, invasive species density goes down. Next slide. New tools are increasingly available to help land managers better understand the landscape context in which they're working so they can mitigate risks. For example, in the sage steppe, partners used widely available NRCS soil survey data to develop a simplified index, a tool that allows folks to understand the relative risks across most of the western rangelands. For example, here the red areas represent relatively fragile rangelands that may be more susceptible to catastrophic effects of fire and cheatgrass than some of the cooler and moister areas in yellow and blue. We can use this type of tool to direct the right practices, from fire suppression to restoration, and maybe over time be more effective in our management. Next slide. On the ground, we're making huge strides in learning how to better predict veg change and disturbance and overcome barriers to implementing effective management and restoration strategies that push rangelands down the right successional pathways. Next slide. So today we're fortunate this morning on our panel to have with us three leading experts, guys that I rely on regularly for their really pragmatic and practical solutions they're developing and implementing in their local communities, both proactively before fire and reactively after fire, to help us better increase rangeland resiliency and combat invasives. So with that, I will be moderating today. I'll introduce each speaker before their talk, and then we'll host some questions at the end, but I definitely would encourage you to type questions as we go so we can have a very engaging discussion. So with that, I'll introduce our first panelist, Dr. Chad Boyd. Chad is a rangeland ecologist and research leader with the USDA's Agricultural Research Service located in Burns, Oregon. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. So resilience and resistance of native plant communities is influenced by management actions, as Jeremy indicated, both before the fire as well as after wildfire. And others today are going to talk about what we do after the fire. I want to talk about management actions that we can take before the fire. And I also want to point out today that I'm going to focus on the Great Basin. And some of what I say may play out differently in other ecosystems, and I think Brian will point some of that out today. Next slide, please. So again, as Jeremy indicated, fire is a natural disturbance process in the 1850s. And let's go back to that year 1850 and think about low to mid-elevation sagebrush ecosystems. Historically, recovery of native plants following fire may have taken years or decades, and research suggests that mortality of native plants could have been substantial with near complete loss of sagebrush, and some of our data have indicated somewhere in the range of 25 to 60% mortality of perennial bunch grasses, and that's indicated in the graph in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. That was from a fire in 2012 in southeast Oregon. Perennial bunchgrass mortality was variable across ecological sites, but again, substantial, 25 to 60%. However, historically, there were no invasives that were waiting to take over that plant community space following fire, so duration of recovery was not likely problematic. If it took 2 decades to get perennial bunch grasses or shrubs back into the plant community, then it took 2 decades. Next slide, please. And historically, recovery probably was protracted because most native plant species, most native perennial plant species, have not evolved to reproduce strongly from seed. And this makes sense because they've evolved in an environment with only episodic resource availability, and to compensate for this, the majority of resources are diverted below ground. So a lot of below ground production, as indicated by the native species in this slide. This below ground production helps these species to survive when water and nutrients are in short supply, but it limits the amount of resources available to invest in seed production. This explains protracted recovery times of native bunch grasses and shrubs following fire due to their inability to reliably reproduce from seed. Next slide. So fast forward to modern day. With the arrival of exotic annual grasses, recovery times following fire have taken on paramount importance. We need restoration success here, and we need it now, because annual species germinate, emerge, and reproduce annually from seed, and because native species have only limited reproduction from seed, exotic annual grasses are ideally suited to take advantage of available ecological space and high soil resources following fire. Next slide. Thus, contemporary reseeding efforts often fail in the annual grass zone because of poor reproduction from seed by native species. Because of poor reseeding success, conservation efforts to build and maintain plant communities that are resilient to the effects of fire are of increasingly high importance, especially with more and more fire on the landscape. Next slide. The most effective way to increase plant community resilience to fire and resistance to annual grasses is to maintain populations of large perennial bunch grasses. As Jeremy pointed out, the rooting mass of these species effectively occupies the ecological space that would otherwise be occupied by exotic annuals. In this slide, this is a slide of the Mealor Homestead Fire, which occurred in 2012. This is 2 years following seeding. This was an incredibly successful seeding. On the right is a seeded area. It's a mix of native and introduced perennial bunch grasses. On the left is a non-seeded area. Again, perennial bunch grasses occupy the ecological space that would otherwise be occupied by annuals. And all what you see on the left there, I should point out in case it's not clear in the slide, is basically a monoculture of cheatgrass. Okay, next slide. So maintaining large perennial bunch grasses, if that's the key to resilience, how do we do that? And obviously grazing management is going to play, since most of our public lands are grazed, most rangelands are grazed in the western United States, period. Grazing management is going to play a role in that. But increasingly, we need to be looking at decreasing the mortality of perennial bunch grasses during fire. How can we do that by management actions prior to the fire? And how can we decrease the probability of fire to begin with? Next slide. Okay. Our research indicates that the majority of bunch grass mortality is from plants that are within 50 centimeters of a sagebrush plant. This is in line with empirical data indicating that shrubs and not grasses produce the vast majority of heat energy during fire. And I'll reference the graph that you see in the slide here. This is from collective data from a couple of different prescribed burns that we did, and each point represents a bunch grass that we instrumented with a thermocouple and measured the heat experienced by that grass plant during fire. We also measured the distance to the nearest shrub plant. The symbols that occur in red are the plants that died. We had, I think, 42% mortality overall of perennial bunch grasses. Well, 90% of those bunch grasses that died during the fire were within 50 centimeters of a sagebrush plant. So pre-fire manipulation of shrub fuels may have a role in decreasing bunchgrass mortality during fire. Note I didn't say elimination of shrubs, but I think that it behooves us pragmatically to think about the amount of shrub cover that we need in a community to meet our management objectives, multiple management objectives, the amount that we have, and if the difference suggests that we could use some shrub reduction, I think that's a tool that we need to have in our toolbox, given the heat energy produced by shrubs during fire and its effect on perennial bunch grasses. Next slide. But bunch grasses and other fine fuels may not produce as much heat energy as shrub fuels during fire, but they do play an important role in energy release of a fire by acting as a vector to carry fire between energy-dense shrubs. So they carry the fire to the energy-dense shrubs. So if we can interrupt fine fuel continuity, we may be able to reduce combustion of shrub fuels and lower heat output during the fire. Does this actually work? Next slide. We're finding that it can. This is some data from Kirk Davies' project that he led here in the southeast Oregon. And in this particular project, long story short, we had plots that were grazed during the dormant season by cattle to moderate levels of utilization for a 5-year period, and they were paired with plots that were excluded from grazing. We came back after 5 years, burned these plots, and what we found is that all measures of fire behavior, including the percent area burn, the rate of spread, the depth of the flame, as well as the height of the flame, were decreased with grazing. In some cases, pretty substantially. For example, if you look at flame height, we had about 3 times higher flame height in the ungrazed plots than the grazed plots. That could mean the difference between direct attack and having to call in additional resources. But in particular, in the upper left, the percent area burned, we reduced the percent area burned. And if time is limited, but if we looked at a picture of the grazed and ungrazed after fire, what you would see is a number of standing shrubs in the grazed plots that did not burn, and you'd see a moonscape in the ungrazed plots. So again, we're taking the shrubs out of the picture by reducing the fine fuels that act to carry fire to the shrubs. Next slide. And we can also impact fuel moisture through grazing. This is some data from the same study indicating ungrazed fuel moistures of 21% for grass fuels on July 4th compared to 46% for the grazed plots on July 4th. And basically, it's not rocket science. We're just removing dead accumulated plant material from the plant communities with grazing, and again, in the process, increasing our fine fuel moisture, perhaps to the point where we could begin to limit ignition of those fuels. Next slide. So just to sum up, I think it's really important that we take to heart, not just in words but in actions, that it's not 1850 anymore. We have a very different, a fundamentally different disturbance ecology that's present within the annual grass zone. And I think what that means is that we're going to have to think outside of the box, outside of the traditional box, and embrace that new ecology if we're going to be able to maintain resilient plant communities. And resilience, again, being imparted by the perennial bunch grasses. And the good news is that there's emerging research and emerging efforts to use fuel manipulations to help us to decrease the loss of perennial bunch grasses during fire, as well as to help prevent fire, and in the process, hopefully increase the resiliency and resistance to annual grasses of the native plant communities. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chad. We can go ahead and pull up Brian's presentation, and I'll introduce Dr. Brian Mealor is our next panelist. He's the director of the University of Wyoming Sheridan Research and Extension Center located in Sheridan, Wyoming. Turn it over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it. I appreciate some of the content from Chad's presentation. It's going to tie in really well with a few of the things that I'm going to talk about, really from a weed management context in rangelands. And I'm going to focus on 2 different large-scale things. Invasion as a process. Sometimes I think that we just are surprised by the fact that we've got invasive species across a large landscape. And then some of those differences across the landscape, that we have different challenges and different opportunities depending on which species are there, what type of ecological sites that we're working with, and the management practices across those zones. So that's kind of where this concept of where do you fit in the picture comes from. But also, next slide, please, Bill. Hopefully you don't fit into this picture fairly well. I actually borrowed this from a website because I feel like it illustrates three things that sometimes we don't keep in the forefront of our mind when we're thinking about weed management and natural systems. One of those is that every tool has its limitations. I think everyone is searching for the silver bullet, particularly for species like cheatgrass. And at this point, regardless of what we want, I think we have to accept the fact that there is no silver bullet. The second thing is that leverage is important, and finding leverage points that are driven by ecological understanding to where we can put a small amount of effort and have a large amount of result is something that we all need to keep in mind when developing management strategies. And then the third thing about this picture is unintended consequences. These guys had a pretty good plan to do some construction, but sometimes our best laid plans have different consequences than what we've necessarily planned for. And so understanding that with a goal of removing a weed species from a site without thinking through the downstream implications might take that system in the wrong direction. So next slide, please. Jeremy talked about Humpty Dumpty falling off the wall, and we can't put him back up there once he's broken again, and this is another illustration of that, overlaid with the invasion process. So across the top of the screen from left to right, I have photos illustrating increasing cheatgrass infestation on what would be started to the left as a sagebrush bunchgrass type community. We know that this process occurs with most all invasive species, and it occurs across the landscape at different rates and at different scales. But for an invasive to become a problem, it first has to be introduced, then established, then it begins to spread and have impact. And if we think about that overlaid with our understanding of stable states and ecological dynamics in rangeland systems, we know that rangeland systems have some level of base resilience that's already come up. And if you could advance, please, Bill, there's a level of disturbance that system will stay a sagebrush bunchgrass community as long as it's able to maintain some of those functions that promote resilience, such as diversity. Now, once that crosses over, what we would consider to be an ecological threshold, whether that's driven by cheatgrass or whether that's driven by other disturbance, it's very difficult to move that back to a more desirable state. And one of the things that I really want to point out on this slide is that this is not something that is dominated or monopolized by annual grasses like cheatgrass. I think that these same concepts definitely apply to things like Russian knapweed, leafy spurge, perennial pepperweed, some of these other problematic perennial weeds that we deal with, but don't seem to get quite as much spotlight because they're not quite as widely spread or as really widely publicized as something like cheatgrass. Next, please. Now, understanding where we are in the invasion process and trying to understand where we are from an ecological perspective informs the steps that we would take from a weed management standpoint. If we're over to the left, we're going to be thinking about prevention or maintenance of a healthy rangeland. If we're beginning to find new infestations, we might really think about something like eradication. Once we've crossed over the threshold where the weed is really driving the dynamics of that system, we start thinking about long-term management or restoration, which Jay's going to talk about a little bit more. Ideally, we'd be able to implement aggressive weed management as we move toward a threshold. And I think the state of the science now is we're only beginning to understand where some of those thresholds exist and develop some indicators for where we might understand if we're moving toward one. Now, for the next set of slides, I'm going to just sort of focus on some of these steps and some of the challenges with these different steps of the process. So this is one of the challenges that we face. Fire has come up as a disturbance already, but there are other types of disturbance that occur in western rangelands. Relatively high density energy development, as you see in this satellite photo. This could also be analogous to small acreage development. Any type of change in disturbance regime oftentimes facilitates one invasive species or another, and moving into a restoration setting, it becomes more challenging than trying to preserve what we have to begin with. Next slide, please. one of the reasons why whenever we have to reintroduce desirable species onto a site that it becomes challenging is sometimes we have to swallow the fact that we've got seed contaminants in our reclamation or restoration seed. This is a photo that former graduate student Will Rose took that shows cheatgrass as a seed contaminant with blue bunch wheatgrass seed. Because of the similar size and shape, weight of these seeds, it's difficult to completely clean out cheatgrass as a contaminant. And so potentially working on better processes to provide more pure seed sources might prevent introduction into areas where those species don't already exist. Next slide, please. Chad talked a little bit about grazing for fuel reduction, and this is some data, we'll call it data, from former graduate student Kara Noseworthy, who looked at targeted, intensive, both sheep and cattle grazing and how that affected cheatgrass seed production over a 2-year period. Kind of a redneck bar graph is what I like to call it. Now, the two quart jars on the left full of seed where it had not been grazed. The small single jar through the center there, spring and fall grazing, and then the one that says rim is rim sulfuron. So practically eliminated seed production from cheatgrass with a treatment of rim sulfuron. Now, the two tall ones were fall grazing only for 2 years, and then imazapic, which is sold as plateau. And for some reason, we had an imazapic failure on this site, and that was not the only one. Soil reasons, timing issues potentially. We were able to effectively reduce seed production with spring grazing on the site for 2 years in a row by roughly 50%. Which seems pretty positive, but we have to keep in mind that that's a reduction from 200 pounds of seed per acre to 100 pounds of seed per acre that's produced that we're still having to figure out how to manage over time. So next slide, please. One of the other things that we use a lot is herbicide, and I feel like this picture, just to explain it to you a little bit, the nice green patches are places where we were able to obtain 99 to 100% cheatgrass control. This was 1 year after herbicide application. Those purpley tan patches are where cheatgrass is still highly productive on those sites. We had a really good response from native perennial grasses on this site, but if we went back and revisited this site in 2 more years, it would probably look like we had done very little to it. And so I usually, when I discuss cheatgrass, I say it's pretty easy to kill, but it's really hard to get rid of. And so continuing some of those follow-up treatments is something that's definitely needed. So those kind of limitations right now, I think the typical expectation that we might have for a good herbicide treatment for cheatgrass, depending on soil type and depending on moisture, might be that we get 2 to 3 years of control, and then cheatgrass is going to be able to move back into that system with one application, which might require follow-up applications. Holly, I may get a chance to answer your question when we move into the question and answer section, if that's okay. If I don't, please remind me to answer it. Next slide, please. So we think about how do we implement these different things across the landscape. And this is just I hope nobody has a seizure from looking at this map. It got a little busier than I intended, but the color scale moving from yellow to red indicates cheatgrass, probability of cheatgrass occurrence in the state of Wyoming from a large-scale modeling effort that our team has done. And it's overlaid with sage-grouse core areas in the blue and mule deer critical winter range in the green. And so what we're thinking through in the state of Wyoming now is how to identify these areas that are susceptible to cheatgrass invasion or susceptible to cheatgrass dominance, or with other weeds as well, and see where they overlap with areas of important conservation value or agricultural value, and focus some of our efforts on those areas where multiple values and multiple threats coincide to get the best use of our funds and our efforts. So next slide, please. I'd say if I had to summarize sort of our strategic approach to weed management and rangelands is that we try to do the right thing at the right place at the right time, which is it's a mantra that we've already heard in both the earlier presentations. It's not as easy as just going out and killing some weeds, but understanding where your situation is and knowing how the species that you're dealing with fits in with that situation, I think will make us much more successful in the long run with invasive species management in rangelands. So, thank you.
All right, thanks, Brian. And go ahead and advance for our last panelist here. We'll introduce Dr. Jay Kerby. He's the Southeast Oregon Project Manager for the Nature Conservancy, and he's also based in Burns, Oregon. Turn it over to you, Jay.
Good morning. Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to WGA for the opportunity to visit with you folks this morning. As previous speakers mentioned, despite our best efforts and intentions, we still have a disproportionate amount of our sagebrush landscapes being burned, ending up looking like this. In the past few decades, fire frequency and fire size have both increased, and because of the strong linkage between annual grasses and wildfire, many of our landscapes require intervention by means of restoration and rehabilitation following fire. Next slide, please. And this is the consequence of failed restoration after wildfire. Annual grass seeds and their seedlings, like cheatgrass and Medusa head, are well suited to capitalizing on recently burned resources, as Chad mentioned earlier. They are prolific seed producers, as Brian just pointed out, and those seeds are very mobile, particularly for anyone that's hiked through a cheatgrass-infested rangeland can attest to. Their seedlings germinate very quickly, they emerge from the soil quickly, and they grow quickly, taking advantage of soil nutrients and water when it's available. In the sagebrush ecosystem, with highly variable timing and amounts of precipitation from year to year, this is a pretty great life history strategy. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, many of our desirable native species, such as those large perennial bunch grasses that are so critical, are less adept at reproducing from seed. On the left-hand side of this seed are a couple of cheatgrass seedlings grown in a lab environment under optimal conditions, so as much light and as much water as they need. And on the right-hand side are 3 blue bunch wheatgrass seedlings grown for the same amount of time under the same conditions. If it's a race for resources like water, who do you expect to win this competition? Next slide, please. As Chad and Jeremy both mentioned earlier, mature bunch grasses can effectively suppress annual grasses and contribute to system resilience. This graph demonstrates that relationship. These data are also from Dr. Kirk Davies here at the Burns Research Station, though there are a number of researchers who have also come to the same conclusion. On the x-axis, we have the density of large bunch grasses, and on the y-axis, we have the density of annual grasses. As you can see, if we have only a few bunch grasses per square meter, say 1 or 2 in the area of a small dining room table, we can expect a very high density of annual grasses, up to, say, 50 to 70 in this example. However, if we can achieve and maintain a density of bunch grasses closer to 5 or 10, the number of annual grasses falls dramatically. Click forward, please. And these photos, these are also credited to Dr. Davies, visually represent that difference with and without the large bunch grasses. So on the upper photo has the low density of large bunch grasses, and on the lower photo is that high density of successfully seeded bunch grasses. And we see that Medusa head is still present in that ecosystem, but it's much less prevalent. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. So we've established 2 things. First, our native seedlings aren't great at reproducing, especially compared to invasive annual grasses. Secondly, we've established that if we can get those native seedlings to become mature, large bunch grasses, they can help us in many ways. Not only will they preclude the annuals, but they also provide us with a better forage supply. They stay green later into the year. They store more soil carbon. The list of the benefits goes on and on. So how to connect the dots? We know what we want, but not how to get there. I would propose that we've not done a stellar job at assisting these native seeds in the ways that they most need. For decades, we've relied on seeding technology from agriculture, such as the seed drill. We've modified it by adding bigger wheels, shock absorbers, and all sorts of bells and whistles. But too often, our investments in restoration seeding still end in wholesale failure, Why is that? We know that sagebrush rangelands are far more diverse and variable than your typical Kansas wheat field, but what specifically is the problem? Next slide, please. These data are from some colleagues who, along with a number of other rangeland ecologists in the last decade or two, have begun searching for answers to the question of why do native seedings fail so often. These graphs represent results from 4 post-wildfire seedings on Oregon's sagebrush range. On the x-axis, we have several key life history stages for native seedlings: planting, germination, emergence from the soil, and survival. Roughly 400 seeds per square meter were planted. Of those 400, between 250 and 300 germinated successfully. However, after that, it all goes wrong. In between germination and emergence, we drop from approximately 300 seeds per square meter to, in many cases, less than 1 seedling per square meter. This suggests that the earliest stages after germination may be the most critical for seedlings. Next slide, please. And in fact, research has identified a large number of fatality causes among native seedlings. These include physical soil crusting, winter freezing, desiccation, and there are numerous more as I list here, but I won't go through all of those. While at first this list might seem daunting because of its length and complexity, knowing the causes of seedling mortality is empowering. Now that we know what our problems are, we can begin to craft some solutions. Next slide, please. Here's a picture example illustrating one example. Some soils, such as silt loam soils on sagebrush rangelands, can form a thin physical crust in the springtime during cycles of wetting and drying. Though this won't slow down a mature plant, presence of a crust at the wrong time, such as the first few days after germination, might be fatal to a seedling that is only 1/8 of an inch in size. So how can we use our understanding of an ecological problem to help us craft a solution? Well, in nature, seeds often collect in groups in small basins or depressions moved by water or wind, or perhaps are stored by a rodent underground but not eaten. So what if we package seeds together when we plant them instead of scattering them out evenly like corn seeds in the crop field? Next slide, please. Well, I have to give credit for this slide to some of my colleagues and to the concept to some of my colleagues. This is some work done by Dr. Madsen and Dr. Svekar recently using some food processing technology, in this example a pasta machine, to create a seed pod that incorporates a number of seeds in a small area that are then planted. Next slide. These are data from Madsen et al., and they demonstrate the effectiveness of these seed pods in one example. In this case, we're looking at sagebrush seedlings. Sagebrush is an extremely small seed, which makes it quite difficult to plant effectively and reliably at the proper depth. This trial suggests that bundling multiple sagebrush seeds together in close proximity increased the number of living seedlings by more than 4-fold. Next slide, please. Another example of how we can use some ecological knowledge of what limited native seedlings to devise a solution is the case of winter freezing mortality. Most of our seeding happens in the fall. With just a few days of soil moisture and soil temps above freezing, a large number of those planted seeds can germinate. In fact, we've observed 50 to 70% germination in the late fall numerous times. However, Dr. Boyd and colleagues have recognized that many of our native seeds are highly vulnerable to freezing. Flip forward once, please. In fact, as little as 24 to 48 hours of frozen soil conditions may cause mortality of 90% of those germinated seedlings. So again, we've identified an intractable ecological problem. Using that knowledge, though, can we devise a solution so that when we make a multi-million-dollar investment in a post-fire seeding, we don't risk complete failure due to something so simple as a 3-day warm snap in December. Next slide, please. In this example, perhaps we can disrupt and delay germination with a hydrophobic coating on our planted seeds. With a coating that gradually biodegrades, can we trick our seeds into not germinating prematurely in the event that we get some warm events over the course of the winter? Next slide, please. And in fact, results from a couple of recent field tests suggest we can do exactly that. On this graph, the x-axis shows the percent of seeds on a burned Wyoming sagebrush site, one of those sites that Jeremy pointed out as being most prone to invasive annual grasses if they burn. This is on the x-axis, the percent of seeds that germinate in the winter, around 10% on some sites on the low end of it, and up to 60% of those seeds germinating in the winter time on the high end. The y-axis shows the percent improvement in surviving seedlings that had a hydrophobic coating versus those without. So we see that sites that had only a little bit of early germination, say 10 or 20%, had a very marginal improvement in seedling density with a hydrophobic coating. But on those sites where we had 70 to 80% of the seeds germinating early in the winter, or excuse me, 50, 60% of the seeds germinating in the winter, we saw nearly 70 to 80% improvement in seedling survival the following spring if they were given a hydrophobic coating. And an important point to make on this slide is that the sites where we had the early germination in the winter time are not necessarily random. In fact, we tend to see a pattern of south slopes and loamy soils being more prone to this early germination than, for example, north-facing slopes. Next slide, please. So in closing, I would just like to leave you with two thoughts. First, there are a number of ecological barriers to native seedling survival, and they vary across the broad range of the ecosystem and from year to year. One issue, such as soil crust, may cause issue on silt-loam soils, but never on a sandy soil, which might have other challenges, however, such as droughty conditions in the springtime. And some challenges may occur in some years, such as early germination when winters are intermittent, but not in other years when winter sets in and frozen soil conditions are constant. Second, I've shown you two examples of how we can use our understanding of seedling ecology and the rangeland environment to develop a new approach to directly address factors limiting successful restoration. Further developing our ability to predict when and where barriers to success occur will empower, quote-unquote, a precision restoration approach where we can apply specific seeding technologies to the locations where they're most likely to be value added. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Jay. And again, thanks to all of our panelists here this morning. Of course, it's always a challenge to try to provide sufficient detail in an hour, but what we're going to do for the next 15, 20 minutes or so is ask some questions among the panelists here that I'll facilitate. While I'm doing that, I would really encourage participants to use that button on the upper right, the Q&A, and enter your questions for us to queue up some additional discussion after some of the moderated questions here. So hopefully we've spurred some thoughts and questions on your end, and we can help have a great discussion about that. So I'll have all of the panelists go ahead and take their phones off mute, and I may direct one at an individual, but feel free to chime in with any of your thoughts and opinions, get some synergy going here. So, you know, I guess the thing that strikes me in listening to all of these talks, and it goes back to management of these perennial grasses, and whether you're in the Great Basin and that's kind of your deep-rooted species, or if you're out on the east of the divide and the plains and you're dealing with more rhizomatous species, it's an understanding of plant phenology, what they're doing, and how our management affects those species. So my first question is to Chad. And, you know me well, Chad. As a biologist, I'm going to press you on this question about, isn't there some risk of damaging perennial grasses when we're using grazing as a tool to reduce fine fuels? And can you talk a little bit more about kind of specific grazing strategies that both reduce fuels and maintain and enhance the health of those key grasses?
Yeah, I can. And to give you a one-word answer to the first part of your question, the answer is yes, there is a risk. And it comes back to grazing management. And to me, grazing is always context dependent. Grazing is not a noun. It's a verb that means many different things. And we have to think about the context in which we're grazing, because there is a potential for damage to the perennial bunch grasses. A couple of strategies that a person might think about there. The first one I would throw out would be dormant season grazing. This is at a time period where the plants have senesced, and we see a decreased likelihood of injury to the plants. So season of grazing can be very important. Of course, intensity of grazing, frequency of grazing, all of the principles of good grazing management are going to fall in there. But dormant season grazing is something that's been tried more and more, and I think we're beginning to see some successes there. A second point that I would make on that is to think about where we're at relative to where we want to be. In other words, if we've got areas in the landscape that are essentially annual grass monocultures, those are areas where we can utilize grazing to reduce fine fuels and not jeopardize existing perennials, because we have very few, if any, existing perennials. And I think that's really important, because we live in ecosystems that are spatially connected. And if we don't put management efforts into those areas that are annual grass monocultures, and grazing would be one tool to help deal with those in a preventative sense, if we don't manage those areas, the consequences of fire ignition, which happens very easily in annual grass monocultures, could easily end up affecting relatively intact native plant communities at more distant locations within the same landscape.
Great. And I guess, Brian, do you have anything to add here? I mean, you mentioned grazing as a tool to reduce cheatgrass seed abundance, you know, and spring grazing and whatnot. Do you have any additional thoughts, considerations on that? And I guess would be similar concerns.
Sure. I would echo everything that Chad said, and there was a specific question about the impact to the perennial plants in our grazing study. We were looking at really high utilization levels of like 90+% utilization, basically bare ground, and I could never with a straight face recommend that kind of grazing if there were desirable perennials that were on that site. And so the site that we were working on was way over to the right end of that spectrum that was basically a cheatgrass monoculture. In fact, it was such a cheatgrass monoculture that we have initiated a competition on that site to see who can restore that back to a more productive system. If you're interested in that, check out the Wyoming Restoration Challenge on Facebook. Sorry, I couldn't resist the opportunity for a plug.
Thanks. All right. Well, I think I'll go to Jay here and ask a question kind of on the post-fire rehab. You know, we spend a ton of resources on that. I think there's a large desire amongst all of us to figure out how to be more successful with our native species for a lot of different reasons. But, you know, there is this debate, ongoing debate, about the use of native versus non-native species and in post-fire seeding, and I guess I wanted to get some discussion going on that because it's a relevant policy topic. But from your standpoint, how does your work inform this? How does our understanding of ecosystem resiliency and the risks out there inform kind of this whole debate about native and non-native seeding?
Yeah, thanks for the easy question, Jeremy.
No problem, bud.
It's a good one, an important one, I think. So, you know, under current practices, you know, we can be successful with native seedings, but that success, I would argue, is limited. You kind of have to hit the right window of the right years. You know, get the right conditions to be highly successful with natives consistently, and we just don't see that with our current technologies. Some of the exotic introduced species, such as crested wheatgrass, are more reliably established after fire, and they're much cheaper also. So we have natives that are more expensive and less reliably established. So that really puts us in a real conundrum. And from the Nature Conservancy's point of view, that's part of why we're investing in some of this research on looking at different alternative approaches to seeding, because, You know, if our choice is to, you know, spend a lot of money and fail repeatedly with natives, or be successful with exotics and establish an exotic monoculture, that's a tough sell, I think, for a lot of conservation values in the long run. You know, we may slow down our fire cycle, and there's certainly benefit to that. We'll provide some high-quality forage, and there's benefit to that. But I don't think we're going to get all the societal outcomes that we're looking for if we don't find some other solutions and other routes to establish native plant communities.
Great, thanks. Do the other panelists have anything to contribute to that?
Chad, were you going to chime in, or?
Yeah, you know, it's hard for me to add anything to what Jay said. I tend to be, I'm a native plant person at heart, and I'm a pragmatist at heart, and those two sides of me compete with each other. You know, if we've got sites, as Jay pointed out right now, native success with native perennial bunch grasses in our part of the world, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Brian, in our part of the world tends to be pretty low on certain sites. And so if we can build in some resilience and resistance with a non-native perennial species, I'm all for it, but I'm also all for the idea of simultaneously trying to figure out how we're going to increase the success of our native species so that we don't have to plant introduced species if we're going to be working on these difficult to restore sites and trying to impart resilience and resistance.
I think, this is Brian, I think I would agree with both of you guys. For some reason I get asked this question a lot. I'm sure you guys do too. And I usually couch it and say, the level of ideology is inversely proportionate to the degree of threat. So if you have nothing but cheatgrass on a highly erodible site and you absolutely have to get something established, and we know that something like crested, I know crested has become almost a curse word in some places, then if you can fit that into a larger scale program, that you can potentially go back. Some of the really interesting work on assisted succession that came out of Utah a number of years ago, potentially using that as an intermediate step to then go back to a more diverse native community. I still don't think we understand the process to do that, but ideally we would be able to get back to a diverse community that is largely driven by natives. But if it's to the point where we have to use something just to sort of capture that site and prevent further degradation, then I think we don't need to completely remove that tool from our toolbox.
All right, thanks, guys. Yeah, you know, we've all said it in our presentations, but we always want a one-size-fits-all answer. And I think our pitch is the right practice or right strategy in the right place. You know, we often joke that the biggest reason for our seeding failures out here is that the native species get in the way of, they recover on their own. So part of it is being a little more strategic in where we invest our resources, predicting that vegetation response, and then, you know, Chad and his colleagues work in overcoming those barriers. You know, we're just starting to understand that basic seedling ecology stuff where we go, why are these things not surviving? So anyway, thank you for that feedback. Brian, I'll keep you on the tip of the spear here. Got a question about, you showed the diagram about, you know, maybe focusing our efforts in a preventative sense where we have minimal amount of cheatgrass and a fair amount of our native rangeland plants still available. Can you speak to some approaches that work in terms of controlling cheatgrass in a setting like that where you haven't had a burn or you have an existing sagebrush? What are the challenges of getting herbicide to be effective in that kind of a scenario?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer. I think most of us wish we actually had the single answer for cheatgrass, but like you said, there isn't one. I think Chad's approach that he discussed, some of their work at using grazing to reduce fine fuel loads, especially in areas where we have sagebrush, high quality sagebrush habitat with maybe a cheatgrass understory that we're trying to conserve the sagebrush in that situation. I think that's something that we haven't done quite as good of a job at focusing on as we have trying to respond after the fire. We're problem solvers by nature, I think. And so one of the challenges that I think we've seen is that when you have a good sagebrush cover on a site is potentially getting herbicides to the soil surface in the case of a pre-emergent application, which typically works really well with cheatgrass, or to newly emerged cheatgrass seedlings. There are some new options that people are working on. I think grazing is definitely a good fire prevention tool, as some of the data out of Oregon and New Mexico and places like that have shown. Delivery methods, do you increase the amount of total solution that you're applying a herbicide on to carry that down through the vegetation canopy to get it to the target? Reducing or really not using something like a surfactant, especially in a pre-emergent situation, because you're trying to get that herbicide to the soil, not to stick to the vegetation. Or there's some new formulations that people are working with. We're doing a little bit of work looking at an imazapic formulation that's carried on sand to potentially get that down through that canopy a little bit better. And so I really think that that's a potential for a proactive approach, that instead of waiting until we've lost the sagebrush from some of these massive cheatgrass or other annual grass-driven wildfires, that we might be able to conserve some of the larger patches of sagebrush that we have. I don't know if that gets to what you were asking or not.
Yeah, thank you. Kind of shifting gears here a little bit, I guess back to Chad. You know, when we talk about the importance of perennial grasses from a resilience standpoint, and that being a fundamental building block of rangelands that keeps them from kind of shifting into undesired states, it gives maybe the impression that other parts of the system don't matter. Could you speak to that? Are perennial grasses the only thing that matter? What about shrubs, forbs, other functional groups in the health of these rangelands?
Yeah, excellent question, and I'm glad you asked it, Jeremy, because everything is context-dependent in management. And we could have a whole series of webinars on the values of shrubs in and of themselves. And, you know, shrubs are going to be incredibly important for nutrient cycling. They serve as critical nurse plants, not just for other sagebrush, but for some herbaceous species like Idaho fescue in our area. That's not even broaching the importance of shrubs for sagebrush, the obvious importance of shrubs for sagebrush obligate wildlife species. So I don't want to demean the importance of plant communities composed of a diversity of functional groups. But if we narrow that down to the context specifically of resistance to annual grass invasion, the data are pretty clear on this. The data suggests that maintenance of perennial bunch grasses, like the graph that Jay showed or the slides that many of us showed, perennial bunch grasses in our area, probably perennial rhizomatous species in Brian's area, those are going to be that's going to be the functional group that imparts resistance to annual grasses. You know, as an example, in our area, we can see beautiful shrub communities that are doing exactly what they should be doing. The amount of shrubs is in balance with the site conditions. And you can have a carpet of annuals in the understory, and that site is an ecological time bomb that's going to go off in the next fire and convert to a monoculture of annuals. So don't want to demean the importance of other functional groups, which is certainly multifaceted, but when it comes to the specific context of resistance to annual grasses, perennial grasses are really the functional group that matters the most.
Great, thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
I seem to always have thoughts on things. This is Brian again, I'm sorry. When we start to expand beyond annual grasses a little bit, and we start to look at some of these other short-lived perennials or even perennial forb type invaders, there is some evidence from some research out of Montana and then a little bit farther west, I think, that shows that there is some benefit to having functional group diversity to increase resistance to invasion from some of those other invasive species. That maybe bunch grasses are not quite enough, and I know that that's what Chad said as well. But the system becomes much more complex, and these challenges become much more difficult when we think about a range and a large suite of invasive species that can potentially have large impacts aside from just things like cheatgrass.
Great, thank you. So the last kind of section of questions I've got for you all before we go to the participant questions here is for everybody. Just weigh in as you would like. But you know, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the structural and policy things that we may need to be thinking about differently. You know, managing for resilient rangelands in the face of these mega fires, invasive species, chronic drought, really is a process, not a endpoint and something that we can achieve overnight. What are your thoughts on the kind of changes that we may need to make to our current land management paradigms that would better equip managers with the ability to deal with these complex problems? So feel free to jump in, anyone.
Well, this is Jay. I'll not necessarily in order of importance, but I think you know, some of the action items out of the secretarial order on fire, I think, are important and are maybe beginning to trend us in the right direction. I work here locally with the Burns BLM district and a number of local stakeholders on a collaborative, trying to wrestle with the you know, how do we take one of our priority landscapes and reduce the risk of, you know, a mega fire. I think what that's forcing us into is some more discussion, particularly around grazing, of thinking about grazing as more than just what happens in one pasture, but thinking about grazing in aggregate. So, you know, what happens in one pasture has a downwind effect, literally in the case of fire, on what exists in the next pasture adjacent to it. So, you know, a scenario being if you have some critical grouse habitat, but the upwind pasture of that is covered in cheatgrass, well, that's kind of a problem waiting to happen. Those may be two different grazing permits, two different ranchers, but we need to be thinking about those two things in tandem and how we manage grazing on that landscape as a whole.
So, dovetailing off something Jay just said, the secretarial order on fuels management 3336, I think that's a really, really positive sign that we're beginning to think about moving in directions that matter at large scales. The thing that I worry about is the sustainability of that. And specifically what I'm getting at is we think of resilience with respect to plant communities, but I think we should ask the question, are our management systems resilient to change? And, you know, we see change in this country. We're seeing political change right now. What's the future of 3336? And I don't know the answer to that. I hope it's in a positive direction. But how do we create resilient management systems? And, you know, I think three things that we could get better at are first off, having that collaborative approach that Jay mentioned. To me, collaboration imparts resiliency to management efforts. And right along those same lines, you know, working at the right scale, working at a scale that is big enough to be relevant and small enough that we can actually work with it, and having a science-based vision that collaborative group can coalesce around. So having a collaborative efforts that play out at workable scales using science-based visions, to me that kind of perhaps defines what a resilient management system is, kind of the bones of it. And that's a concern that I have going forward, is that we start to pay attention to building resilient management systems so that moving in the right direction can move for long enough to actually matter with complex problems. Because, Jeremy, as you know, those complex problems, managing complex problems like annual grasses, is not an event. It's a commitment to a long-term process, and we need our efforts to be around long enough to matter if we're going to be dealing effectively with complex problems.
Great. Brian?
Yeah, I was actually just taking in some of what Chad said. I thought that was a really interesting comment, and I agree with that. You know, he said in his presentation it's not rocket science. It's range science, and it's actually a lot more difficult, I think, because there's so many different variables that are out of our control. And so having that flexibility to make some of those decisions for a longer term, maybe outside of some of the current restrictions that we have from a regulatory standpoint, I think is something that would probably benefit all of us. One of the things that really comes to my mind, I guess, just from sort of I don't know if it's really policy, but just sort of a common practice, is as new invaders move across the country, sharing data effectively and mapping you know, distribution data, but also control data across different areas, so that we can be kind of ahead of the curve as those species move into different areas, and much in the same way as fire management that these guys are talking about. You know, that it's sort of that slow-moving biological fire, and if you don't have an idea of where to look for it next through ways of susceptibility modeling or things like that, then you potentially are going to waste a lot of time looking for a needle in a haystack that may or may not show up. So that's kind of one area of improvement that I immediately think of.
Great. Well, I'll just offer up my thoughts before we move on to the participant questions here. But, you know, being a wildlife biologist, heavily engaged in the sage grouse issue, and, you know, hanging out with enough range cons starts to really, you know, challenge my thinking for how do we secure the ecosystem services and functions that we all want and preserve that basic capacity of rangelands to give us forage production, wildlife, all of those things. And I can't help but think that, you know, starting the conversation when we sit down at the conference table and talk about objectives for a piece of ground, that, you know, starting with a fundamental goal of resilience, and again, not as an esoteric and nebulous concept, but, you know, focus back on what we know, what drives resilience in these rangelands, and let's figure out ways to achieve that while balancing the myriad of societal demands. So I feel optimistic, even though we have a lot of challenges, and so I really appreciate you guys sharing with us your thoughts. We'll go ahead and launch into the questions here for about 15 minutes. So I'll just start at the top here. We've got a question from Holly Prendeville for Chad. The question was, on one of your slides, what was the proportion of invasives in the grazed and ungrazed plots?
Yeah, good question, Holly. And so that would have been on the that would have been on the Davies 2015 paper, and those were largely intact plant communities. Off the top of my head, gosh, annual cover of annual grasses is going to be less than 10%. So the idea with that study was specifically to select for relatively intact plant communities and look at grazing as a tool for fuels modification to help hang on to the key components of those plant communities when they did experience fire.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Charles Orchard, but I think I saw this asked in various different ways, so we'll maybe just open it up to folks here. But okay, we're talking about grazing management. We're talking about careful management such that our perennial grasses are healthy and vigorous, but also potentially reducing some of the fine fuels. And the question is about rest, and if rest is really the most important factor to retain bunch grass viability, and if so, how do we determine what adequate rest is?
Yep. This is Chad. I'll take a shot at that. I think the last part of that question is the most important part of that question, is how do we determine what adequate rest is? You know, we've got a lot of axioms that we like to throw out in range management and range science, take half, leave half. grazed during a specific time period. But I think the key to that is the monitoring part. Too often we don't have adequate monitoring to support our management decisions, and determining what adequate rest is, to me, is going to involve an adaptive scenario whereby you're putting in place a monitoring plan that allows you to track the abundance of desired species over time to make sure that your grazing is consistent with your expectations for those desired species.
Excellent, thank you. The next one, I guess, is for Brian, and the question was about cheats, easy to kill, hard to get rid of. Is that because of the strong seed bank or long-term viability of the seeds themselves, or just what exactly?
It's related. It's related to the seed bank, absolutely, Charlie. The data doesn't indicate that it's got an especially long seed viability compared to some other species. I saw somebody commented on mullein earlier. I mean, mullin's been documented to have 30% viability after like 100 years burial in the soil. Current thinking is cheatgrass seed viability in the soil and some carryover is probably in that 5 to 10-year range. But it's really able to reestablish the population and ramp its numbers back up even from small numbers of seeds. So one of the steps, this will relate to a few other things that I have seen on the little scroll down through the questions. One of the ways that people are sort of moving toward trying to fully deplete that seed bank from a site is follow-up herbicide treatments several, maybe 1 to 2 to 3 years after the initial treatment. We've got there's a suite of herbicides now that you can rotate mechanisms of action and do a couple of those different things that would maybe help prevent development of herbicide resistance. But really, the ability to deplete the seed bank is what we're going to have to try to reach, to attain, to effectively remove cheatgrass from a given acre. There's some current work coming out of Colorado State that kind of suggests that they were able to do that on one site with about 5 years of complete prevention of seed production from cheatgrass. So there's probably a range in there somewhere, and I think we're only just now starting to understand how to effectively deplete that seed bank for the long term.
All right, thank you. The next question asks, could someone please provide more information on what soil properties other than soil temperature and moisture should be looked at when evaluating ecosystem resilience? And I guess I'll take a stab at that since I mentioned it. And I'm sitting here calling in from a soil scientist's office, and he's got dirt everywhere. So I'd be remiss not to mention there are a lot of other things that inform that. And so things like soil texture, you know, both the surface and subsurface at various levels, the depth of the soil are properties that are particularly important, proportion of rock fragments, some other key components like that really influence that plant community. And the way I guess I simplify it in my head is think about that upper 20 inches of the soil profile. What's influencing that root zone of our desired plants, both from a growing season standpoint where you have biological activity kicked on and off, and two, moisture. How does moisture move through the soil profile? And so when I think about that, there are a number of soil properties that influence that. There are topographic things like aspect that influence that and slope. So we're really, you know, giving some large-scale indices here as tools, but I think it's an exciting frontier for us to be able to utilize that information to better assess, you know, and predict just how these vegetation communities will change. So with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next question here. Okay, our favorite question, and don't jump up all at once to get at this one, guys. Soil bacteria, and the question is thoughts and opinions on the potential of soil bacterial treatments to control annual grasses. Is this a potential landscape level tool for the future? And maybe maybe to start with, I'll go to Brian, and then others can weigh in here.
Thank you, Jeremy.
You're welcome.
So I would say I hope that it has the potential to become an effective landscape level tool for the future. At this point, I would treat it just like I would any synthetic herbicide that I have really seen no strong replicated data to know whether it works. So it's my job to be skeptical, and I'm still in the skeptical phase. I do know there are some pretty broad scale evaluations of the bacteria that are going on in a number of different ways. I know there's the weed specialist here at UW, Dan Tekela, has a few trials that he's got out, very intensive work there. BLM is doing some sort of larger scale things around the western U.S. to try to attach some data to the efficacy of the bacteria, both alone and when applied with a herbicide. So I guess that will be my answer, is that I hope that it becomes a tool, a very effective tool that we can add to the toolbox. But until I see consistent supported data to support the efficacy of MB906 or D7 or ACK55 or any of these different strains, I will stay hesitant. Anybody else want to jump in?
Sure. This is Jay Kerby in Burns. I would echo Brian's thoughts. You know, I'm certainly hopeful it would, if it does prove to be widely applicable, that would be very exciting. You know, my understanding is we're not quite there yet, so wait and see and be skeptical until I see that evidence. The only thing I would add to what Brian said, though, is that, you know, we have a number of methods already to kill and reduce cheatgrass, and even if the bacterium works, you know, beyond our wildest dreams, we still have to replace that cheatgrass with something, because nature abhors a vacuum. If we create a vacuum on these landscapes where cheatgrass was previously present, something else is going to occupy that space. And so unless we're prepared and able to replace that space with something desirable, I think we run the risk of, you know, creating an opportunity for the next new invasive to swoop in and dominate some of those sites that cheatgrass previously dominated. So if it does work, it has to be part of a strategy that includes as a critical component replacing the cheatgrass with the more desirable species.
You know, Jay, if I could respond to that too, I would say have a replacement plan, a revegetation plan, or in cases where cheatgrass is beginning to really ramp up, but there's still an inherent recovery potential by the perennial plant community that is there. That may be an opportune time to do a treatment, regardless of whatever the treatment is that stresses the cheatgrass. And I know, I mean, we've had a lot of examples in our part of the country where you drive by a piece of ground and it looks like all there is cheatgrass is there, and then you do a treatment and you get a great flush of perennials that come back. And I know they're not coming back from seed. They were just suppressed by the competitive ability of cheatgrass at that point. So that's the only caveat that I would put. Other than that, I completely agree. Thank you.
Yep, point well taken, Brian.
Yes, this is Chad. I just want to say ditto on what Jay said. It's really easy to become distracted from here in the Great Basin. It's really easy to become distracted from what the problem is. And I think for us here, the problem has been for a long time. How do we get those desired species back into the plant community? And when someone comes up with a way to kill cheatgrass, it's an easy point to rally around without forgetting that the heavy half of that question, which is how do we get the desired species back in, still looms out there. And that's the part that, to me, needs a strong focus, and we need to maintain that focus over time.
Yeah, you know, one final closing thought on just the idea of killing cheatgrass. You know, Brian's leverage slide with the chop saw on the back made me think of, you know, with resilience management, it's kind of about understanding and capitalizing on those opportunities, you know, and I think increasingly in a post-fire environment, you know, we're understanding and utilizing existing tools. Herbicides are increasingly available and approved for use on our public lands, and when we can respond quickly, where we think we have, you know, sufficient perennial grasses left in a post-fire environment, you know, simply putting down a pre-emergent application of a Maestas or something like that could be all that's needed to push a community in the right direction, and followed by, you know, proper grazing management through time. But, you know, those are the types of things we need to start looking for and breaking down barriers. I have one last question. We've just got a minute or two here, and this is a really great question. It's, you know, the human/political elements add to the complexity of managing public lands for resilience and resistance. How can land managers work with agencies and lessees to consider innovative strategies for managing frequency, intensity, or duration of grazing, I'm assuming, for resilience? And we got to summarize that in about 1 minute.
Could you repeat that last part, Jeremy?
Yeah, so the question is about what are some innovative strategies, or maybe think about it this way, what do we need to do better when we're managing across private and public lands with grazing to actually achieve some of the things we're talking about here?
Yeah, so this is Chad. I think it comes back to some of the components of resilient management systems, and I think that it's incredibly valuable. Let me just say this: when local scales within agencies are given the decision space necessary to put together collaborative efforts with private landowners across the fence. And I think that's where it all starts, is having that decision space where you can be collaborative and discuss things like resilience management and how we're going to get there.
All right. Well, I don't think any of us could say it better than that. Thank you to all of our panelists, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Bill or Troy to close us up.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. We're very pleased. That was a great webinar, a great conversation, and yeah, really a deep dive into a very interesting topic. So I'll just hand it off to Troy Timmons to just let us know a little bit more about the initiative and what to expect next from it.
You bet. Thanks, Bill. The next workshop that we're going to do will be held in Bend, Oregon on January, I think, 23rd, 24th, just in about a week and a half, where we'll get a state update from Oregon and delve into a number of the issues that we've developed over the course of this initiative. We don't have the next webinar set yet, but we do expect to continue the webinar series. We've got a number of different issues that we'd like to tackle on that. As far as today, good grief, I can't think of a better panel to have discussed these rangeland management issues. You guys did an excellent job of taking a difficult subject and rendering it into easily understandable English, which is not easy. So Chad, Brian, and Jay, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Jeremy, thank you for moderating the discussion, and we really appreciate you guys. All the slides that were shown on today's webinar are, as well as the recording of what we did today, will be available on WGA's website. If you go to westgov.org, we have an initiative page set up for this. You click on the webinars, and all of the information that you've just heard is available there if you guys want to go back through it, or if you want to refer someone else to today's discussion. I believe also everybody that registered to listen to today's webinar, we're going to send you a separate email as well that'll detail these links today's discussion, and so hopefully that'll happen, what, the next couple of days, Bill? Excellent. With that, I think we're finished. Thanks again so much for being on today's webinar, and for everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate your interest. Hopefully you found this productive and useful. Thanks again, and we'll join you all next time.